Well, good morning. We are so glad that you have decided to join us this morning on Zoom. We were just talking about having our first in-person service today as well, which was a very exciting time. But as Brian just said, we're really excited about this opportunity as well, just because we can be connected from all over the globe. So that is very exciting for us. We have our monthly partner for the month of April is Compassion International. We've been talking about them for the last several weeks, and today we are specifically focused on compassion. We're going to give you a special opportunity to sponsor a child through Compassion this morning. You may have seen that in social media this past week, and so we are really excited about that. But if you were here for the first time, or if you invite someone for the first time and they attend, we like to give a $10 donation to our ministry partner. And as I said, this month it is Compassion International. So we are excited. We had several first-time people in person this morning, and so I am excited to be able to give them more donations because of you guys inviting. And when you give, you allow us to be able to do things like that in the world and in our community. So thank you for being generous with us and with the people around you. We're in week 3 of our Whatever series. And as I said, we have a special emphasis on compassion today, and we're talking about greed. And I'm really looking forward to what we unpack together today. So I'm going to pray for us, and then I'll hand it over to Jim to lead us in singing. Jesus, thank you for how you love us. God, I just pray that today you would help us to hear from you, help our hearts to be in tune with you. And God, I just pray that you would do an amazing work in our lives. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Just one word, you claim the storm that surrounds me. Just one word, the darkness has to retreat. Just one touch, I feel the presence of heaven. Touch, my eyes are open to see, my heart can help but believe. There's nothing that God can do, there's not a mountain that He
Have you ever dreamed of winning the lottery? Yeah, I see some of you shaking your head. When I was a youngster back in the day, I got letters in the mail that would tell me that I was a winner. And they came from this old guy. You may have heard of him before. I don't know. His name is Ed McMahon. And he's actually no longer living, but he would write me letters and he would say, "You have won." And then there'd be some kind of like little disclaimer below all that, that I had to like buy magazines to actually increase my chances of winning. And so I'd say, Mom, I need to buy Sports Illustrated. I need to sign up for these magazines. And um, you guys might know the end of the story, but I never actually won the lottery. But I always dreamed about it because of Ed McMahon. And in this whole process, I had dreams of like having this extensive baseball card collection, which is a pretty big dream right there. Maybe having a cool car that my parents could drive me around in, because my dad had like a 66 Bonneville, not so cool, especially when I was a teenager. But now it'd be really cool. Anyway, I digress. Winning the lottery was a dream. And some of you have had that same dream of winning the lottery. And the question I wanted to ask you is, if you won the lottery, would you still work the same job? I mean, some of you would, because like Alan and Daphne, they are the boss, right? So they're not going to fire themselves, and they want to have purpose with what they're doing, and they're helping a lot of people with what they're doing, which is pretty awesome. But there's some of you would be like, I'm done. And some of you are like, maybe you're still in school or you're in college or high school, maybe even middle school. You'd be like, I'm going to drop out because I mean, why do I need education? I got all this money. I got all this change right now. But we all have thought about what we might do if we had a big fortune. And talking about this and talking about greed, I actually dug up some stories of people who won the lottery and their lives went to crap. Like, there are so many stories out there. And I was reading these stories, and some of them are like over the top, really inappropriate. Like, you read about what these people did. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. Like in the first service, we had kids in there. I'm like, I can't even share this story. So I kept it a little more PG, even though it's still not great stuff. But I'm going to share with you a couple of these stories that of people winning the lottery and their lives falling apart. And the first one was a lady named Evelyn Adams. She won the New Jersey lottery not just once, but twice. So you're saying there's a chance, right? There's a 1 in 17 trillion chance to win the lottery twice. But she did it in 1985 and in 1986. But she had a problem. She was a compulsive gambler. And by the end of her life, she was living in a trailer with nothing to show. Then there was William Bud Post the Third. I mean, that name should say it all right there. That's probably a problem to have a name like that. But he won 16.2 million in 1988, which was a lot of change. And his obituary warned that a huge financial win does not guarantee happiness. He had his 16.2 million paid out in $5,000, or I'm sorry, $500,000 payments annually. Can you imagine getting $500,000 annually? And some of you are like, oh yeah, I've had that salary before. I just got to tell you, I haven't. So I can't imagine it. And probably a lot of us can't imagine it. But every year, not having to work, here's $500,000. A lot of us think, I'd probably be doing okay. Well, within 2 weeks, he spent $300,000. Can you imagine spending $300,000 in 2 weeks? He bought a car lot. He bought a restaurant. And he bought an airplane, even though he didn't fly. That's kind of odd, right? Bought an airplane. Oh, okay. I guess maybe because he could. And after he had the money for 3 months, he was actually $500,000 in debt. He spent $1 million in 3 months. Then his brother tried to put a contract out on both William Bud Post III and his wife. And it was actually his sixth wife. I need to mention that. Six wives. I wouldn't consider that success. Just me, just saying. In 1993, Post said, everybody dreams of winning money, but nobody realizes the nightmares that come out of the woodwork or the problems. He was found guilty of firing a shotgun at a man who had come to his Oil City mansion to collect a car repair debt. And after he served the sentence, he was reportedly living on a $450 per month disability check. He had 6 marriages that ended in divorce and declared bankruptcy. Post died of respiratory failure at 66 years old. Is that not one of the most saddest stories you ever heard in your life? And for us that have dreamed about winning the lottery or getting rich fast, which is probably all of us at some point in time in our life, I would say it's not all it's cracked up to be. Just because you have doesn't mean you're going to be great. Just because you have a lot doesn't mean you're going to be great. And one of the major problems that our world deals with is greed. And some of it is very easy to see, and then some of it's more subtle. And so I did some research here on some signs of greed and thought maybe you've seen people like this that I'm about to share with you, or maybe you've seen some of these tendencies within you. And ultimately, we want to help you win. We want to help you defeat greed, because greed is not a good leader. Greed is not a good way to be characterized. And at the end of your life, you don't want people to say, man, he was sure greedy, or she was the worst. She was a greed master. So, I'm sorry, 7 ways. I called them the salty 7, just because that's fun. That we can struggle with greed. And the first one is to be overly self-centered in our behavior. And this is the idea of being about me, with very little regard for anyone else and their needs. And some of you, you know, people like that. Some of you, you've been that person. You know a lot, or you can discover a lot about a person when you watch them play a game and they don't win, or it doesn't turn out right for them. And I may be stepping on some toes here because, well, I'm kind of that person sometimes, or I have been. And I'm trying not to be. I'm like, okay, I don't want to be greedy for the win. But sometimes, man, I've said or done stuff that I'm not all that proud of. Or how about this one, the second one, envy. Envy and greed are like twins. Envy sees what other people have and has a strong desire for what they have. I mean, one of my favorite lines in Napoleon Dynamite was when the uh, Tupperware salesman Rico, Uncle Rico, is selling Tupperware, and that lady says, "I want that." And I just think about that line a lot. But have you ever heard someone like see what someone else has? Maybe a girl is really attractive, or someone has a lot of stuff, and they're like, "Man, I hate her," or "I hate them." That's an example of envy, and it can eat us up. Or third, greedy people lack empathy. Greedy people lack empathy. Lacking empathy is a sign of greed. It's caring about your own interest over other people's interest. It's an inability to enter into someone else's pain or someone else's need, and basically to say, well, that stinks for them, you know, but I got my own needs. Or it's number 4, they're never satisfied. You may have a lot, you may have a lot of resources, or, you know, like compared to the rest of the world, I've heard stats that say basically if you're an American, you're pretty much in the top 3% of wealthy people in the world. I don't know how accurate that is. I haven't done the research to actually tell you that's a fact, but I can say that I think we could easily say we're in the top 10%, most of us, of the wealthiest people in the world. And yet it's so easy to get caught up in this culture where we constantly are marketed to with products that say, you're not okay, you're not okay, you're not okay, you're not okay. And you need to buy me to be okay. And we get sucked into it. And it's very subtle because people are masters at marketing to us, knowing that we naturally drift toward greed. Or there's this one, greedy people are manipulators. They will say what they need to do and they will do what they need to do to get what they want. They're concerned about getting credit for what other people do quite often, and people feeding their ego. And then the sixth one is greedy people are into short term thinking. They're about the short run. They're willing to sacrifice the future for the immediate. And you've seen people do that. You've seen corporations do that to try to get the numbers up, to try to look good on a spreadsheet or a balance sheet. They will make certain decisions that are very short sighted in order to make themselves look good and sacrifice the long term because they're all about themselves. And then really this is kind of this last one, the seventh one, ties into that sixth one. They don't respect limits or boundaries. When they know something is right, they're willing to compromise it if it gets them what they want. And you've known people like that. And maybe sometimes you've been people like that. The reality is none of us want to be known for our greed. So question we have to ask ourselves is how do we defeat that from having a place in our life? And one of the things I really love about this series, this whatever series, is the letter Paul wrote to the Philippian church back in the first century, 30 years after Jesus had resurrected from the dead, speaks so powerfully today. Like the first week we talked about anxiety. And if I were to ask you to raise your hand, and I'm not asking you to raise your hand, but if I were to say, how many of you have ever struggled with being anxious or having anxiety? If you're being honest, you would all raise your hand. Or if I were to say, how many of you have ever struggled with contentment? Because we talked about discontentment in week 2. How many of you struggle with being discontent? You would all raise your hand if I ask you to raise your hand, because that's just part of human nature. And so he writes basically this letter that peeks into things like anxiety and discontentment. And today we're going to talk about greed. And not that he necessarily speaks to greed in this part of the letter, but he talks about how generous this church has been in a very powerful and profound way. And I mentioned a guy last week that I just love his name because his name is unique. His name is Epaphroditus, which I just think would be a great, I would love someone to name their kid Epaphroditus, because Epaphroditus is just he was an awesome dude, but it's a unique name. I mean, I've never seen anybody named Epaphroditus, but I just think it'd be cool. It'd be like, oh, you got that from the Bible. That's so sweet. But Epaphroditus, he delivered generosity, goods to Paul in prison in Rome. And so he was coming from Philippi, which is in modern day Greece. And to go from Philippi to Rome, you would have to travel approximately 796 miles. Now, that's the equivalent of driving from High Point to New Orleans, give or take, or from High Point to Miami. That's not close. And they didn't have cars, and they didn't have airplanes. I mean, maybe he had a horse. He's like, hi, I'm Silver. I don't know. But that would be a long way. There's also the Adriatic Sea that's kind of in the way. And so he would have to get on a boat to actually get to Rome, to go to Paul to say, hey, Paul, here is a gift from our church, and we want to support you, and I'm here to support you in your ministry. And by the time he got there with the gifts from the church that we talked about last week, he got really sick and he almost died. But Paul then wrote this letter and sent Epaphroditus back, which in some ways may seem a little bit cruel because, man, that's another 796 miles back the other way. But Paul wanted them to have this letter to know how much they had impacted his life. And ultimately now today, 2,000 years later, this letter that he wrote that Epaphroditus took back to Philippi is changing lives today. Not just here, but throughout the world. And it will continue to do so. And so last week we finished with Philippians 4:13, and that's that famous verse, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And we've heard that misquoted quite often in culture. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And that's just not true. I can't do everything that I want to do. But in context, I can do all this, like he talked about anxiety. I can choose to not be anxious and trust the Lord with my thoughts, and to think about whatever is true and whatever is noble and whatever is lovely and admirable, and all the things we talked about in the first week. I can, through the strength of Christ, choose contentment and learn contentment because of what Jesus has done inside of me. And then today we're going to talk about this whole greed piece and how through the power of Jesus, we can defeat greed. And so he talks about, I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And so if you have a relationship with Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is one of the most compelling reasons to follow him, because he gives you strength. In verse 14, he writes this of Philippians chapter 4. So if you're following along, Philippians chapter 4, verse 14, he says, yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. So he puts in a statement of contrast. The word yet is kind of like a but. It's like, but. And he's doing this because he wants them to know that he is grateful for their generosity. He's grateful for the Philippian church's generosity. He wants to make sure, hey guys, I need you to know that I'm learning to not be anxious. I am learning the secret of contentment. But you need to know that you seeing my trouble and giving to my trouble and doing something about it by sending Epaphroditus, that's powerful. And I want to ask you this. Have you ever had someone see you when you were struggling and not just really see you, but go to that next level of giving to you and doing something for you? It's a game changer when you see, when you give, and when you do. And it kind of reminds me of another line from a letter Paul wrote to another church in Galatians, where in Galatians 6:2, he says, bear one another's burdens. Sometimes brothers can be a burden, but bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. When you take on the burdens of someone else by seeing, by giving, by doing, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. What is the law of Christ? It's loving people like he loved you. How do you love you? How do you love me? He died for us sacrificially. It's sacrificial love. That's even beyond treat people like you want to be treated. It's a next level kind of love. And that's what the Philippians were doing for Paul through the power of Christ, and then Paul doing back for them by sending Epaphroditus back with this letter. See, give, do. And I thought about this famous quote, and I don't know who came up with this quote. I can tell you, I didn't make it up. I'm not going to take credit for it. But you may give without loving, but you can't love without giving. You may have heard that before. You may give without loving, but you can't love without giving. That's a strong message. Our willingness to give, to see, and to do, and to enter into someone else's pain is really the thermometer for our spirituality and what we're really about. In verse 15, he continues, he says, and you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, so he goes and he starts his church and he's sharing with them about Jesus. He says, no church, no other church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving, except you only. They were standout, not because they were impressive in their appearance, but because of their actions. We all want to be a standout with our actions. And when you give, or when you see a need, when you give to it and you do something about it, you stand out. It's powerful. And they saw themselves as partners. So no church entered into partnership. Being a partner essentially says that I don't just see myself as doing something about it, but I'm a co-laborer. I have ownership in this mission. I have ownership in this vision. And it made them stand out. They were essentially being the hands and feet of Jesus. And then in verse 16, he writes this, even in Thessalonica, that is very hard for me to say. You sent me help for my needs once and again. So that was a city where he had started another church. And the Philippian church, not being a wealthy church, sent more support to Paul financially because they were so invested in the mission to see people come to know Jesus. They didn't have a lot, but with the amount they had, they gave a lot. And so he again says, hey, even when I was over here, you would never meet those people. You may never know those people, but there may be an opportunity. And he speaks to this a little bit more in this next verse, that you're going to make an impact that you'll never know. That'll go beyond you. That'll go beyond this life. And one day when you're on the other side of eternity, you'll meet that person you impacted because of your generosity of seeing, giving, doing. And he pretty much says this in verse 17, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. They will be producing fruit for all eternity by their generosity in helping this church in Thessalonica. And that's powerful. And I think for us as Connection Valley Church, there are people we've already been able to invest into and make a financial gift to, and actually be there with ministries like Feeding Lisa's Kids. And because of that, there are going to be people in heaven one day that look you in your eyeballs and they're going to say, thank you. You made a difference in my life. And I think that's mind blowing. Because in verse 17, he kind of says this. He says, I don't seek the gift, not that I seek the gift. I'm not seeking you to give me stuff financially or give me support, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. Basically, what you're giving and what you're doing is producing fruit for all eternity. And see, they were long-term investors, the Philippian church, not short-term investors. They weren't just thinking about themselves and taking care of themselves, which would have been so easy to do because, like I said, they didn't have a lot, but they were thinking with the ultimate in mind, not the immediate, but the ultimate, which is a powerful way to live. And it makes you stand out, not to make yourself great, but to make God great. And one of the questions I think we have to constantly ask ourselves is, are we seeking immediate gains or ultimate gains? Are we seeking immediate gains or ultimate gains with how we are living our lives and how we're spending our money? You see a lot reflected when you look in the checkbook and see what comes in and how it goes out. And unfortunately, a lot of us, I'm not saying this is necessarily true about you, it could be, it's been true about me at times in my life, have viewed the resources that God has entrusted me as for my consumption first, and then I'll give the leftover. And that's not a long-term mindset. That's a very greedy mindset. And I'm thankful that people have spoken into my life to help me see a bigger picture, one that focuses on eternity and not just the here and now. In verse 18, he says this, I have received full payment and more. I've been blessed abundantly, essentially, is what he's saying. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus. Love that name, by the way. The gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. You guys have gone above and beyond. I would love it one day if people would say about our church, you guys go above and beyond. I think in some ways, some people already have. I want to keep doing that, not for our glory, but that people might come to know Jesus. In verse 19, he sums up this all up by writing this, and my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. The payoff of generosity is God meets your needs. Now, does that mean he meets all my financial wants or everything I think I need? We know that's not true. But he meets our spiritual needs. And when our spiritual needs are met and they're in proper perspective, everything else begins to fall into place because my focus is in the right place. And I see purpose and passion with my life. I can live on purpose with purpose. So what do you want to be known for as an individual? And what do we want to be known for as a church? If you've been with us for any length of time, which looking at you guys, most of you have been, you know, our mission is to influence people to life-giving connection with Jesus, their family, and community. And, you know, we haven't just said those words. I mean, I'll just speak to the community piece for a second. We have partnered with at least 12 organizations that I can think of in the last 8 months by giving financially to them and by showing up. I just want to read this list to you because when you realize that you guys have been used in this kind of way, it's powerful. Like feeding Lisa's kids, for instance, we've been able to give them plenty of funds in order to help feed kids that don't have enough food to eat. And we've had a lot of us show up to be able to help with food insecure families and to make sure they have their food distributed, because otherwise these kids may not eat and they can't help the family they were born into. Or the family room of the Triad in helping with foster kids, or the Winston-Salem Rescue Mission in helping with men who are trying to recover from addiction and get back on their feet, or the New Life Family Outreach Pregnancy Center and helping people who have had a baby or are contemplating whether to have an abortion or not, and to help support them in that process of helping them find adoption or actually having the baby and helping to meet some of their needs. Or the Baptist Children's Home of North Carolina in helping orphans. Or Simple Gesture, also a food, an agency that helps food insecure families. Cross Trail Outfitters of the Triad, Energized Ministries, Jamestown Middle School, Mills Road Elementary School, and now worldwide with Compassion International. It's powerful, y'all. And because of your generosity and some of your physical involvement, you've made a tremendous difference this past year. I just believe we're scratching the surface. We've got more opportunity that's on the horizon, and I'm excited about it. And it's a huge way that we can defeat greed when we step into the needs of other people by seeing, by giving, by doing. I don't know what the next step is for you, but one of the things we're doing today is we're having a Compassion Sunday where you're going to get the opportunity to sponsor a kid who's living in poverty, who doesn't have the nutrition needs that they need, the basic nutrition needs, the basic education opportunities, or the basic medical care they need. And the great thing about Compassion International is they help kids that get sponsored with all those needs, plus it's in a Christ-centered environment. And it's when you say, hey, I'm going to sponsor a kid, you're seeing them, you're giving to them, and you're doing something about it, because you can enter into a personal relationship with them by writing letters and even visiting them. You have the opportunity to send them additional gifts like at Christmas time and at birthdays. It's powerful. We've done this over the years. And I told a lot of you last week that Brooke took a kid out from Nicaragua, and his name is Lazaro, and he had never been out to eat before, and he was 12 years old. And so like they're teaching him what to do at a restaurant. I can't even imagine. I know you can't either. But just to kind of drive this home, I stumbled upon a story last week, and the story is about a guy named Everett Swanson. Now, some of you were with us at the 9 o'clock service, and so you've heard of Everett Swanson. But if you weren't, I want to ask you, have you ever heard of Everett Swanson? Probably not. I mean, it's not a name I hadn't heard of until this past week. I couldn't believe I hadn't heard of him before. But I heard a story and I wanted to read it to you because it's just that powerful. The details of the story are what make it just kind of go next level. And it really lands us where we're going today with the idea of see, give, and do. But Everett was a pastor in Chicago in the early 1950s, and he was typical. He was neat, unassuming, friendly, and he was always attired in a conservative suit and tie. He didn't look like a world changer. He looked kind of stuffy. And yet he was a world changer. And it all started when his winter coat was stolen. That's kind of a weird way to start something big, but it happened when his coat was stolen. It was the height of the Korean War when Everett felt God calling him to leave a comfortable Chicago pastorate to work as a full-time evangelist. He packed his bags at the first opportunity, a brief trip to Korea. Notice I said brief. where he would share the gospel with soldiers. It was the first time ever traveled outside the United States. And on one cold day during his visit, Everett went for a walk. He was a curious stranger in a strange land. And while he quietly strolled through a Korean city, he was suddenly aware of a young boy running up to him. In an instant, the child grabbed his coat and ran off. The pastor gave chase, which I can only imagine would be a pretty funny scenario, right? He's chasing this little Korean kid in Korea. And he immediately found himself running into a shanty town dominated by crude makeshift shacks. He had never seen poverty like this in his life. Though he didn't catch up to the boy, he did spot his coat laying at the entry to one of the ill constructed homes. And stooping to retrieve it, he was shocked by what he found. Underneath the coat were small, frightened orphan children, shivering and horribly thin. And at that moment, he said, I got to do something to help them. He got them some warm soup, a few blankets, and he was soon surrounded by a growing crowd of kids. The next day, he went back. And along the same street of shanties Everett had seen the day before, there was a large garbage truck, and men were throwing rags into it. As Everett got closer, he realized with horror that the rags were bodies of children. And these were children who hadn't made it through the night. Even more horrible, he realized his truck was going through the entire neighborhood, not just this one small area. The reality was overwhelming. Starving and dying children were everywhere. A few days later, on the plane ride back home, Everett struggled with a personal question a ministry colleague had asked him. What are you going to do about the children? The answer came within days. He told a few Christian friends the story of the needy Korean orphans he had seen. He didn't ask for money, yet they offered it. Believing that Everett could use it to help the children, he took their willingness to give as confirmation that God was leading him to a new work. And though the name was not legally adopted until 1963, Compassion International was born. And for 13 years, until his death in 1965, he devoted himself to helping Korean orphans. Everett's wife, Miriam, continued working with Compassion, and at the time of her death in 1994, she was the director emeritus of the organization. Just a few years ago, Compassion actually surpassed getting over 2 million kids in poverty sponsored, where they get basic education, basic nutrition, basic medical needs met, and they get to hear about Jesus. That is the epitome of see, give, and do. So I don't know what the next step is for you, but in a few moments, we're going to give you an opportunity to take a next step. And before we do that, Jim's going to lead us in a song. That's a song that we've sang before. And it speaks to what Jesus did with death, that he arrested death by his own death. And in doing so, new life was made possible for you and for me. And in that new life that we want to share with other people, which is the essence of the Great Commission, which Jesus said right before he went to heaven of go and making disciples of all nations, there's an invitation for us and for others. See, Jesus, he saw, he gave, and he did. So I don't know what's next for you, but I'm going to pray for us, and then I'm going to kick it over to Jim. Jesus, we thank you for what you've done to release us from the grip of greed by giving your life for us. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for your generosity. And thank you for doing something about our need. Thank you that you didn't just do that and leave us by ourselves, but that you stay with us through the power of your Spirit. And so I pray today that you would help us take whatever next step we need to take. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Alone in my sorrow, again in my sin, lost without hope. over me. You have made me new. Now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new. Now life begins with you. Our Savior displayed on a criminal's cross, and darkness rejoiced as though heaven had been lost. But Jesus arose with our freedom in hand. Oh, that's when death was arrested and my life began. That's when death was arrested and my life began. Oh, your grace so free washes over me. You have made me new. Now life begins with you. It's your endless love pouring down on us. You have made us new. Now life begins with you. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the reading. Oh, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life began. Oh, we're free, free, forever we're free. Come join the song of all the reading. Oh, we're free, free, forever, amen. When death was arrested, my life began. When death was arrested, my life began. That's when death was arrested and my life began.
I'll say this again, like I said in the last service, Jim, I just wish you had more passion, bro. No, I'm just joking. Man, you crush it. I'm so thankful for you and thankful that you have been such a huge part of Connection Valley Church. Personally, for me, I'm even more thankful that you've been my friend. So thank you for offering your time and talents the way you do. I'm going to take this time to turn it over to Brooke and let her tell you a little bit about Compassion International before we break into small groups, because Brooke has been an advocate for Compassion International for years, and she became that by the influence of Stacy Martin. So thank you, Stacy. And so, Brooke, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad that you said that about Stacy's influence, because that was going to be the first thing I said. So it's like you read my notes or something. So thank you. Yes, so Compassion is a fantastic organization. One of the things that I love about Compassion so much is that when you sponsor a child through Compassion, you are actually sponsoring a specific child. You are not just giving money that goes into their community. You are sponsoring a specific child, and they set it up so that you can develop a relationship with this child through writing letters. And Brian mentioned that I had the opportunity to meet one of our sponsored children on a trip to visit Corey and Stacy in Nicaragua. And it, I think, is one of the most impactful experiences of my entire life. I can't think of anything else that tops it, just because of making an investment in someone who lives in another part of the world and then laying eyes on this person. It was amazing to meet Lazaro and his family. And so you are giving to a specific child. And I think that that makes a difference. And in these communities, there are people who check on these kids. If they're not showing up to the project where they meet, where they hear about Jesus, where they have their tutoring or whatever, it's a little different in each country, but there are workers in these facilities that if they don't see these kids, they go out looking for them. They go to their homes, they know where they live, they make sure that these kids are being taken care of the way that they are supposed to be, and the way that you as a person who is giving, that they are operating with integrity. And the numbers of children living in poverty are absolutely staggering. I wanted to share just a couple of things with you. There are 385 million children in our world who live in extreme poverty. That's almost 20% of the world's population of children that live in extreme poverty. There are millions that are unable to attend even primary or elementary school. There are millions who are malnourished or undernourished. And there are billions of children in the world that don't have access to clean water at home. And I just think that that is staggering, because those are things that so many of us take for granted. We just don't even give a second thought to clean water or an education or those things. So there are children across this world who are dealing with circumstances that we can't even imagine. And so we wanted to give you guys the opportunity to rescue a child who's living in poverty, to establish a relationship with a child who is living in some of these conditions, so that they can experience the hope that comes from Jesus, and knowing that there is another human being on this globe who sees them and cares enough to do something about it for them. So obviously I care about this very much, because it makes me get choked up. But the sponsorships for these children, it's $38 a month to sponsor a child. And that may feel like a large amount of money, but Brian always quantifies it with, you can take a family of 4 to Chick-fil-A for, it costs you more than that if you're going to feed your family of 4 at Chick-fil-A, probably. So it's a $38 a month sponsorship, but what you receive in return, I think, goes far beyond that. So that's just a little bit about compassion, a little bit about the sponsorship. Brian, I don't know if there was something that you wanted to say, if I left something out.
You did a great job. Thank you for that. And I love your heart in expressing that, because it's real. You've been there with a kid on site before. You've been at different facilities. I know when you went to Nicaragua with Corey and Stacy. And so to see a kid and then to spend time with him and to see that your investment has made a difference, that's just a gift. And the opportunity for our church eventually to do some of that is definitely on the table. So they gave us several kids to look at from different countries this time. They actually have 25 countries they work in. And in the last service, we had a kid, his name is Jesus, and he was, I think, 4 or 5 years old. And you spell his name Jesus, which spells Jesus. And he was sponsored because I just basically said, here's a kid. I held him up, and this is not Jesus because someone took him today, but someone in the service took Jesus and said, I want to be his sponsor. So right now I have another sponsor, and we just thought it'd be interesting. His name is Mohammed. So, I mean, kind of a famous name. You got Muhammad from Islam, but you have Muhammad Ali, who is the greatest. But this kid lives in Ethiopia, and his birthday is January the 1st, 2011. So he's born on New Year's Day. And he's been waiting more than 448 days for a sponsor just to get basic nutrition, education, and medical care. And if you were to sponsor him today, you would be giving him hope, but you also would be giving him the hope of knowing Jesus. So I'm just going to throw it out there. The first person in the chat who says, I'll take him. Muhammad's yours to take, to sponsor. And I know some of you that's burning in you right now, and you know that's what you're supposed to do. And I normally don't do this kind of stuff. I actually told the people at 9 o'clock, I said, if you're trying to debate on whether you give to our church, maybe you're a first time giver or whether to sponsor a kid, we definitely want to keep doing stuff through the church and we need the financial support. But I would rather you sponsor a kid that's in poverty. So I'm just going to, okay, well, we got a sponsor. I was about to wrap it up, but Brooke and Chad Taylor have taken Mohammed. So you are now going to be able to give hope to a kid. My Brooke will be reaching out to you about the next steps. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking that step. Brooke, do you have anything else you want to add before we go to our small groups?
Yes, I know that because we are in this online format, that may be a little more challenging because I cannot place that packet in your hand at this moment, but I have two other options, ways that you can sponsor a child. And I'm going to put it in the chat here in just a second, or Brian can put it in the chat as I say it. You can text to sponsor. The number is 83393, and you text the letters CVC. So Connection Valley Church, CVC, text CVC to 83393. And when you do that, they will respond with a text message and a child for you to sponsor right there. And then you can just follow all of the prompts that they give you in your phone. The other option that you have is you can go to our Connection Valley Church website, and one of our scrolling banners right now for the next week or so is a call to hope, Compassion Sunday. You just click on that banner and it's going to take you to the give page. And at that point, you can follow the instructions to sponsor a child there too. That will direct you to a specific portion of Compassion International's website where they have designated children for our church to sponsor. And you can look through all of the hundreds of kids that need sponsors there as well. And you can take your time to sort through those. If you want to meet up with me at some point during the week and see the physical packets that I have, I'm happy to meet you. As I said before, this is something that is very important to me. So I'm happy to meet you somewhere. And we will have packets available. If they don't all get sponsored, we will have those again in person next week and at our CV students event next weekend as well. I think that's everything that I wanted to mention about that.
Oh, and Brooke, if I can just say one thing too, just from someone who's on the ground, like, I was a compassion advocate like you when I was in the States, and just coming here and seeing it from this side of it without someone from the US trying to give me their tour and talking to the local people, everyone's like, yeah, that's an organization that actually does what they say they will do. Like hearing the local people talk about it and seeing the kids who've been through it and who've now graduated and who are working here. And this is one that actually works. This is one that really, really does what it says it will do. This is like, I believe in it so much. And when we first became missionaries, everyone's like, you have to stop advocating for compassion. You need to advocate for your own ministry. I'm like, no, God's big enough to do both of them. And we can't do all of it. We need compassion to take care of all these kids because we can't take care of all of them. I mean, they needs to work hand in hand. Like, yeah, we believe in it 100%. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for saying that. I feel like that was my personal experience, but you live it every day. So thank you so much for adding that in. I think it gives just more and more credibility to an organization when you live in the community and you see that, yes, they do what they say they're going to do, and it benefits the child and the family. But the relationship and the hope that you're able to give that child, it makes a huge difference. You see the difference between children who are sponsored and the children who are not.
Yeah,
absolutely. So yes, thank you so much. I think that's all I have. Brian, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to say before we break out to small groups. So I'm going to break you out into small groups. Please stick around if you would like to. And again, you can reach out to me at brooke@connectionvalleychurch.com all week. If you are interested in sponsoring a child, and we will get you hooked up. Brooke and Chad, I will touch base. We'll get connected this week. Have a great week, you guys.